Hello, welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca and I'll be your host. I'm so glad to see all of you here with us today. A lot has changed since we've last gotten together. And one thing is for sure, there is so much opportunity to make good things happen in the States, thanks to all of you. We are in for a good show today. I've got three guests here with us. Jane McEnany, who is over all of our education initiatives here at SPN, Ben Wilterdink, who is over all of our policy initiatives, and of course, Todd Davison, who's our Vice President of Programs. They're here to share the hottest trends happening in different policy areas, and they're going to tell us about the biggest fights happening in state houses across the country, because you all know sessions have started and big things are happening thanks to you. This network is ready to go. They've already gotten started. Before we start talking with them, I'd like to first welcome our president and CEO, Tracy Sharp. Tracy's coming to us from California, where we all know the impact of policy decisions really is impacting people's lives. Tracy, how are you? How are your friends in California right now?
Thanks, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the call today. We're doing fine here. Where I live in Northern California is about 380 miles north of the Pacific Palisades and Eaton fires, which so far we're unaffected up here except for a little smoke in that tragic situation. As of today, it's over 40,000 acres in the state of California have been devastated by wildfire. More than 12,000 structures, including schools, businesses, churches, homes, have been destroyed, and at least 25 people have lost their lives. The images coming out of Los Angeles are the area are devastating. And my heart and condolences go out to everyone affected by this tragedy. Out of this situation, I'm so proud of the California Policy Center's quick response. They are working with Donors Trust to create a California Wildfire Relief Fund to provide direct aid to those in need. You can find instructions, I think, on how to support that fund in the chat. You know, during natural disasters, I'm reminded of the importance of state level governments and that they must make on the ground high stakes decisions in times of crisis. What happens locally matters, and what doesn't happen matters too. This is why our focus has always been on the states. We know that today's policies can have life altering consequences for tomorrow. Only time will tell the true extent, but one thing is clear. To keep our communities safe, prepared, and prosperous, we must have the right policies in place. And for those laws to be properly executed and enforced. I want to turn it over to Ben Wilterdink, our Director of Policy Initiatives, and he's going to share some of the policy solutions the network has relentlessly advocated for to prepare and, where possible, to prevent disasters like this. So, Ben, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. It really is a tragedy what's happening in California, and I just want to emphasize while every fire example is unique, there are some basic trends that we do know, and what we do know about preventing and mitigating forest fires is that we get the best outcomes when we have local control. So the Bureau of Land Management and federal lands, which make up a very large portion of our Western United States, they're operating under a very complex web of legislative and regulatory barriers that sometimes prevent best practices. And they don't have the local knowledge that the people who are in the state on the ground often do have. And so that is what our network has been focused on when it comes to this issue. And this is something we've been talking about in the network for years. So going back to 2019, the Washington Policy Center and Todd Myers up there has laid the groundwork for using good neighbor authority and some options for how states could do timber harvesting to clear out some of these areas and prevent that kind of fire overgrowth In 2020, the Goldwater Institute in Arizona teamed up with the Mackinac Center in Michigan to do some additional work on forest management and how states could really take the lead on managing those forests, clearing out brush, creating the fire breaks that are necessary, that the federal government is just ill-equipped to do. And then finally, I'm excited to announce, even before all of this was going on, the Washington Policy Center, Todd Myers is returning to his work, and we are supporting their efforts to expand Good Neighbor Authority, which is basically the states are allowed to go onto these federal lands to do these clearing of different kinds of overgrown forests or clearing of brush. And what they're allowed to do is they're allowed to timber harvest and sell the timber that they're harvesting to support their efforts for forestry management. And so Todd is working with our federal partners to see if we can expand that authority to include tribal lands as well, because right now they're not able to participate in that program, which leaves big sections of land, especially out west, more vulnerable to these kinds of fires. So that's some of the work that we're doing on this, and our heart goes out to the people in Southern California. But I do think that at some point there will be room for a conversation to talk about how this kind of thing might be prevented going forward.
Thanks, Ben. So much of what this network does is not only to be relevant and responsive to what's happening right now, but to prepare for it ahead of time. And there's definitely room right now. And I know there's been a lot of work, as you said, to prepare for this moment. So thank you for that update. And before we get into some of the other policy issues, I'd like to hear from Todd Davidson. Todd, can you tell us a bit, just as a reminder to folks, since we've gone through a whole holiday and we're all kind of getting back up to speed on what's going on around us. We know that the affiliates, our network leaders, are on the ground right now, whether it's dealing with things like wildfires or any other policy issue, they're making all of the magic happen. And in future America at its Best shows, we are going to feature them so you can hear what's happening in the thick of battle. But Todd, can you share with everybody how SPN partners with our think tank CEOs to get these policy wins? Tell us more about how that happens.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So a reminder, two objectives guide everything that SPN does. We believe in local solutions led by local leaders. To get those, we need infrastructure in the states, advocacy infrastructure. So state think tanks, legal power, investigative journalism, candidate recruitment training, all of these pieces of infrastructure at the state level that are there to fight for policy reform today, and then they're going to be there to defend the policy reform and then advocate for the next policy reform. So objective number one is we want to see stronger infrastructure. We want to see more infrastructure. And then objective number two is we want to see more policy wins. We want to help that infrastructure deploy so that it is achieving policy wins. And this is our business model, this up on the screen. So how does SPN do this? We're a little bit different than a typical think tank or national organization. It's a four-step process. It starts with strategy formation, follows up with capital investments through grants, and then we don't just grant and forget about it. We follow those grants up with support. So strategy formation, real quick. This looks a bunch of different ways. Sometimes SPN's helping the group one-on-one. Other times we bring multiple groups together where they sharpen each other's strategies. And sometimes they have perfectly fine strategies on their own, and SPN just learns about them to then take that into step number two, which is our State Solutions Grant Fund. So if you're a donor who's interested in seeing multi-state wins and building infrastructure across the country, but perhaps you may not have time to pay attention to all the 50 states or where all your investments are. This is a good place to partner with SPN. We take your funds, your donor intent, your goals, and we match up where your intent matches with the best opportunities that we know about in the state think tanks. We then provide those investments that help support the state think tanks as they're building infrastructure and advocating for policy reforms.
What do you mean by support the state think tank, Todd? Like, what kind of support do they need? They're doing just fine on their own.
Yeah, and a lot of times they are doing perfectly fine on their own. Financial investments allow them to take what is maybe a $50,000 or $100,000 campaign and upgrade that to a $200,000 to $250,000 campaign. So they're reaching more policymakers, they're reaching more audiences, they're exerting more influence on policy change. And then from time to time, my team here, Jane and Ben, and others on the team are there to provide support. It could be a range of tailored support, whether we're helping them continue to shape their strategy, we're helping them shape their messages, we're helping them think through the challenges that they face, or coming alongside them. In some cases, we have lobbyists on the ground who lobby on behalf of the state think tank as well. So a whole range of tailored support that helps ensure that they are, number one, they're learning and growing and building stronger infrastructure, and number two, increasing the likelihood of getting that policy win. Of course, then the legislative session ends. We see the score, how many wins happened, how many are going to be teed up for next year, and we reevaluate and start the whole process all over again for the next year. And this past year, we made 64 investments in issue campaigns and advocacy efforts throughout the states through this business model.
Okay, so now let's move over and talk about the investments that we've made in education and what we're seeing in education. Jane, can you tell us a little bit about trends happening right now, 2025 in education? So much has changed just in the last 5 years. This conversation is totally different. What kind of trends are going on?
Well, I mean, we've just seen tremendous growth in the expansion of private school choice programs like ESAs and tax credit scholarships, and we fully expect that trend to continue. In fact, just this morning, Governor Lee in Tennessee called for a special session later this month, and our friends at the Beacon Center are working hard to make their existing geographically limited ESA universal so that all families can benefit. Similarly, in Texas, a new House Speaker was just elected yesterday, who is a committed champion of school choice. Texas Public Policy Foundation is leading the coalition on the ground, making sure that families throughout the state are aware of the opportunities. And, we've learned from the last couple of years of 12 states passing universal choice programs that passing the bill is just the beginning of our work. And what I'm really excited about is SPN's leadership on better program design so that once these programs are passed, we can implement them so that they fully realize the vision of what they're intended to do, serve families.
So on education savings account in particular, Tennessee and Texas are the states to watch. Are there any others? Because I remember last year you said, watch Alabama, they're going to go universal school choice, and they did. So do you have any big predictions this year outside of Tennessee and Texas?
Texas and Tennessee are the two we're looking at as far as going universal in 2025. That said, lots of other states like Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota are poised to create brand new programs for the first time. Not likely to be universal, but it's a good starting point. And then states like New Hampshire and Georgia and Mississippi and Montana are looking at expanding or adding to the offerings that they currently have.
Okay, what about South Carolina? Should we be keeping an eye on them?
Oh, you bet. I am very excited about the possibility in South Carolina. In fact, on Monday, Governor McMaster presented his executive budget proposal. He's already set aside $30 million, indicating that he's going to be supportive of the lawmakers who are looking to seek revenge for the dismantling of the education savings account that was struck down this fall, unfortunately.
Yeah, and just
Palmetto Promise Institute is just doing fantastic work. They've collected stories by the 3,000 families that have been impacted by that horrible decision, and they're making sure that lawmakers are hearing from them.
Great. Yeah. And just as a side note, from what I understand, Palmetto stepped in when the court struck down the decision for school choice, and they raised money from private donors, and the fundraising is still going on to keep these kids in their private schools for this school year. And they are now going after the ESA in 2025. So there's a lot of good things happening, a lot of energy. I live in South Carolina, so I have to plug the state. Yes,
Rebecca,
Todd, do you have something?
can we jump in about how important this is? Because I'm reminded of the great philosopher Rocky Balboa. When he said, "It doesn't matter how hard you hit. What matters is when you get hit real hard and then you keep moving forward." So on school choice last year, we got hit twice. South Carolina school choice reform got repealed. Nebraska school choice reform got repealed. And guess what? The opposition was like, "Yay, we won." We can't just take that and lie down. We got to go back to South Carolina. We got to get that reform enacted again, and we got to go back to Nebraska. The best thing about Nebraska secret is the union spent $6 million trying to repeal that. It is not going to take us $6 million to get that program reenacted. So I'll take that trade every year. Get a new program, get the kids signed up for 2 years. Unions are going to come back in 2026 and they're going to have to spend another $6 million. But we're going to be more ready for them in 2 years because we're going to have 2 years worth of stories to tell so that the people of Nebraska know the benefits of school choice. Most importantly, we got to send a signal to our opposition. We're not going to back down. But we know this is a fight for the long haul, and we're going to punch back.
Something to signal from Todd's point and illustrate about SPN's policy change model is that, yes, we're looking at have policy wins, whether they're legislative, litigative, or regulatory, but we're playing offense and defense. And I think too often the movement generally can get excited about wins in red states. Hopefully it goes without saying that we can't discount blue states. After all, 60% of this country's GDP is housed there. But we shouldn't think of defensive wins as just happening in blue states either. In fact, on education choice last year, our 3 biggest defensive wins actually took place in 3 states with red trifectas: Florida, Arkansas, and Montana. So we're playing offense and defense and anticipating challenges across the country.
That's great to know. I'll get to defense. Actually, let's stay on defense for a second. Such a big part of the strategy that we walk through with our affiliates is you've always got to be ready for litigation because we will get sued when it comes to education, just about anything these days. So what legal battles are happening now in which states and which ones do you anticipate that might be coming down this year?
Well, certainly there's ongoing litigation in Utah for their education fits all program, their universal ESA, continued litigation in Montana where, we got an initial win in July, but the fight continues and our friends at the Frontier Institute are leading the way there. And then, our friends at Opportunity Arkansas are looking to codify the LEARNS Act in the state's constitution this year. They've gone 3-0 so far on defending that incredible law, but if they are successful in a constitutional amendment to protect it, we're going to be prepared for a challenge on that too.
Okay. You were starting to talk about implementation because who cares if we get all of these wins if nobody is taking advantage of using school choice? So I guess my question is, where are we seeing some action there? And tell us what we need to look out for. What are some key states? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, I think, implementation is discussed really broadly on lots of different policy areas. In education, SPN's priorities for implementation are fourfold. So defense, we've talked about protecting education freedom through the courts, but we're also working on the supply. So building a robust supply of education options, unleashing entrepreneurs to build new creative models that are out of system. We are so lucky to work with Karen McDonald, who is the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow for SPN. She does tremendous work and has really inspired affiliates to dig in there. Also, spreading the word, marketing these education programs. It's really exciting that nearly 40% of children in this country are now eligible to receive some type of support in their state for private school choice, more than 20 million kids. That said, last June, our friends at EdChoice released data that says we've only hit the 1 million mark. So we've got a long way to go as far as making sure that families are aware of their options and think of choice as, a default option, not just going to the district school. And that's okay if they do, but making sure they know what's available to them. And then finally, really having our affiliates be equipped to come alongside families and help them navigate these programs once they're enacted. It can be really complicated to figure out the marketplace, especially if you're inclined to be an unbundler and do something a little more creative and complicated than just using your ESA as a transfer for private school tuition. So we want our affiliates, and that we're learning from them on how we can help families and support them through the process.
What states do you feel like have done the best work on different implementation avenues?
I've got to shout out the Libertas Institute in Utah. I mean, the work they have done, they passed last year after years of work, a zoning regulation that has already saved micro schools, putting them on equal footing as far as the regulations that they face trying to just serve families. So on that regulatory burden piece, they're doing great work. I also look at a state like Mississippi, where Empower Mississippi's waitlisted campaign is making sure that lawmakers are aware of how many kids are still. Mississippi has a ESA right now just for special needs students, but it's not fully funded. So all the kids who are eligible aren't able to access that support that they deserve. The list could go on of states that are really excited and reaching out to us all the time about SPN's competitive model, which is our vision for really making sure that these programs, regardless of the vehicle, are treating families as the customer, not the state.
So if the family's the customer, if a family wants to stay in a public school, because most kids are still in them, what kind of things are happening in public schools to ensure that things are improving there?
I'm so glad you asked, because as excited as we are about all the progress and momentum on private school choice efforts, we're also working on other in-system reforms. So whether it's improving open enrollment policies, so public school choice, to make sure that kids aren't geographically restricted based off their zip code. We've got affiliates working on that. The Mississippi Center for Public Policy is doing great work on improving open enrollment policy in Mississippi. We've also got groups working on career and technical education. The Pioneer Institute is doing incredible work on this in Massachusetts. They have an amazing Voc Tech program. It's well utilized, but in urban areas where a lot of families are either economically disadvantaged or English language learners, they're really trying to make sure that that opportunity and offering is expanded so that more kids can benefit. And part of the beauty of this network in action that I like to think of SPN as is our affiliates communicate with each other, whether it's facilitated by our 50-state viewpoint and perspective, if we're the ones making that connection for affiliates, or if they're just reaching out on their own. So Pioneer is going to be putting together a toolkit of resources so that we can spread their ideas and lessons learned to other states. And we see that all the time among affiliates.
Okay. Thanks, Jane. We'll come back to you in a bit. Let's move over to Ben. Hello again, Ben.
Hello.
Ben, I want to talk with you a little bit about energy. First, can you share with everyone SPN's perspective on energy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So energy is in everything, the cost of everything. Everyone is very worried about cost of living, but energy prices affect things that are built, things that are made, things that are transported. So I just want to make that quick point that energy is not some siloed issue, but it really does affect everything that we touch every single day. And to that end, our biggest goals are to make energy as reliable as possible and as affordable as possible. And so those are the guiding lights, I would say, for our energy program. And so there's a few different ways that that is implemented, and network affiliates are doing good work on that, and I'm happy to talk about those. But that is certainly our overall vision.
So reliability and affordability. Okay, I got a couple of questions for you about this. So I've got a close friend, a supporter of our network, who is really fired up about offshore wind, and he's done a lot to fight it. Is there any movement? Do you foresee any movement in the states on that issue this year?
Yes, big time. Offshore wind is definitely going to be a big area to watch. The incoming Trump administration has signaled that they are looking at stopping certain offshore wind projects, certainly the new ones going forward. And I know that our affiliates, the Caesar Rodney Institute and Dave Stevenson over there, is in touch with their federal delegation this week, working on getting an executive order drafted that the Trump administration will be reviewing to halt some of the ongoing offshore wind projects that are happening in the mid-Atlantic and kind of northeast area. And so that's definitely going to affect things nationwide. And so even though partly that is a federal thing, our affiliates are still very engaged because they have the local knowledge of what's going on in their communities and on the ground, and they're able to communicate that up to their federal delegations and into the administration. But there's also different lawsuits that are going on, some that are spearheaded by the Caesar Rodney Institute in Delaware, some from other areas in New Jersey. The Garden State Initiative is working with a network of grassroots opponents of offshore wind to stop some projects in there. And those lessons that they're learning and the points they're making are applicable on both coasts. So there's definitely a lot of crossover, and they do trade notes on that a lot.
Okay, good to know. And by the way, I'll continue my line of questioning, and at the end we will get to Q&A. So please, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box at the bottom. Just a reminder. All right, so let's talk about the grid. Everywhere I turn, I'm hearing about the grid. So what's the relevancy with the network and what we can do about the grid, and what are the debates happening in the States?
Sure. The biggest debate I think happening in the States as it relates to the grid is are we going to sacrifice reliability and affordability in the name of these abstract goals, whether it's net zero or what have you? And so our network is pushing back on that. Basically, our perspective is, look, we should be shaping our energy frameworks in a human-centric model. They exist to serve people. And as we saw in Texas just a few years ago, it's easy to forget, but bad things happen. There are lives on the line when people don't have the energy that they need to heat their homes. And so prioritizing the reliability is something that we are very, very focused on. And what that really means is making sure that we still have what's called baseload power sources, right? So these are power sources that can be switched on, they run continuously, they don't rely on batteries, they don't rely on weather. They are there when you need them to meet the demand when the demand is there. And our infrastructure needs to be have a lot of those on the grid, basically, in order to be as reliable as we need it to be. And there's a big push from the other side who wants to prioritize these other things that are heavily subsidized, wind and solar. But not only are they heavily subsidized, but they also are very, very intermittent. And having them on the grid jeopardizes, and not only does it make things more expensive for ratepayers and also consumers in every area, but also it jeopardizes that reliability, which is the key point. And so it's making sure that when new things happen on the grid, when certain power plants go down, they're replaced with baseload for baseload sources, and you're not replacing a lot of these baseload energy sources with unreliable and intermittent sources.
And
So
for anyone else who's
go ahead,
listening,
Jane. Yeah.
this energy policy stuff is a little over your head like it is mine. I'd love to just share a practical implication of this that Ben and I discussed this fall after the devastation of Hurricane Helene. We were talking with one of our network leaders who lives in Georgia, and he shared that the night before the hurricane came, further up the coast, he had this nagging feeling about getting a generator for his house. And he turned to his wife in bed and said, I got to go to Home Depot. I'm going to get a generator. And she was like, okay, and rolled over. And they had a newborn at home. So she was like, I'm going to bed. Well, devastation hit their neighborhood. They lost power. Because he got that generator, he was able to save all of her breast milk, which we all know is liquid gold. This is what Ben means when he's talking about things being reliable. And this is something that all families can relate to. God forbid they have to.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. That was part of my next question. And Ed Johnson, I see your question in the chat. I was just about to get to natural gas, so thank you for bringing it up. Ed asks, where does natural gas availability and pipeline modernization fit into the equation? And part two is, how do you counter NIMBY? So I will leave it to you, Ben, to answer those.
Okay, yeah, happy to. So natural gas is a huge part of the solution. As Ed, I'm sure you're aware, and maybe others on the call are aware, we are an incredibly resource-rich country. We have so much natural gas in this country, and we could power the entire nation for decades and decades and decades if we decided to unlock that. So natural gas is a very big part of the solution. Uh, Also, natural gas, even if you take the more environmentalist side, at their word, it's far, far cleaner in terms of emissions than a lot of other baseload sources, such as coal. So natural gas is definitely a big part of the solution. I think where our network sees it fitting into this is there have been a lot of states that have adopted these quote unquote renewable portfolio standards, which says that a certain percentage of the energy mixture that's produced in the state has to come from green, quote unquote, green energy sources such as wind and solar. And I think what we're doing is we're able to demonstrate that natural gas really is a clean energy solution. It's much cleaner than a lot of the alternatives. And when you take into account all of what goes into manufacturing the wind turbines and the solar panels, their footprint doesn't look quite as great as advocates might want you to look at. And so when you look at that entire life cycle, natural gas is stacking up very well. And there's some movement in some states to even get natural gas implemented as one of those green energy solutions that would fit into that renewable portfolio model. So I think you're going
Which
to see a lot
states?
more of that. I would definitely watch out for the work that's being done in the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania and the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. Both of those are doing great work trying to get natural gas implemented in their states. So yeah, I'll leave it there and see if there's any follow-up.
Can I jump here and emphasize that like now is the time to go on offense on energy? Uh, Ben mentioned renewable portfolio standards. So these got implemented 15 years ago, and it was when there was this fantasy that green energy was going to innovate to the point where it will be reliable by 2030. So 15 years ago, 2030 was 20 years ago, 20 years away. So states across the country were like, by 2030, we are going to be a significant 50% renewable. And even red states like Kansas passed these kinds of things. Well, the landscape has changed. What policymakers should have anticipated, because they were told over and over again, is these sources are not reliable, they're intermittent, they surge and then they drop. They surge and then they drop, which puts a whole bunch of wear and tear on the wires. The second thing that they didn't anticipate, they should have, was that the geopolitical environment got a whole lot messier. Our adversaries, Russia, Iran, China, they want to use energy as a weapon. So we need to be producing and be energy dominant for the US and for our allies. So we shouldn't have adopted these portfolio standards. And finally, the last thing is this surge in demand from artificial intelligence in these data centers. They didn't anticipate that. So even if you have more renewable sources, that increased demand on energy means that you need to stick with the baseload power like natural gas and nuclear and others. So this is happening. This is coming home to roost. And you're seeing this in the corporate sector first. You saw many companies run away from things like ESG and net zero goals. We're seeing it at the federal level, and we're going to be seeing it at the states. Those states that Ben mentioned are where we're going to see the fights first: Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina. Utah passed some really good bills as well last year. Back to you.
Thanks, Todd. Okay, next question that just came up in the chat. How about recommissioning nuclear plants? What do you think about that, Ben? And on that same topic, tell us more about nuclear.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think that's a great idea. We've actually already seen one recommissioned. 3 Mile Island is being brought back into service. So that is happening. Recommissioning, I think, is our best and fastest way to get nuclear deployed because it is such a very capital intensive project to undertake. That being said, the main barriers so far, I mean, there are capital barriers. I mean, that's always true, but we've done great things. We've built amazing things. There's no reason we can't do that with nuclear. The real thing that's stopping it has been regulations. So the NRC is the federal agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have not approved plans for a nuclear power plant since their inception in the 70s, a new one to be built. So for 50 years, they've stalled that. And right now, we do have an opportunity to move forward on nuclear energy. And actually, Our friends over again at the Caesar Rodney Institute, they're very involved with their federal delegation, and so they're in discussions with the federal delegation on getting regulations loosened so that more nuclear energy can be deployed. And so we're looking at supporting their work in getting these regulatory changes at the federal level that would allow that kind of investment to take place. And then we're also discussing at the state level what are ways that states can prepare for that kind of implementation? What are siting considerations? Are there ways that we can start thinking about deploying new technologies like small modular reactors that are housed in like closed down coal plants where all of the transmission lines are already in existence, so you don't have to rebuild out the distribution model. So those are things that we're thinking about and considering, and our network is on the forefront of looking at.
Ben, are there any other states people should keep an eye on when it comes to energy, whether it's offense or defense for 2025?
Great question. I think the state that I would want to keep the most eye on is Ohio. So Todd mentioned that there is a growing demand from these large industrial users. Right now, it's artificial intelligence, but the tech sector in general needs more energy. There's new technologies coming online, innovations are coming online, and they're very, very energy intensive. And so right now, some of those large industrial scale users are in discussions with the utilities in Ohio to figure out how can they connect to the grid, how can they access the power that they need at the affordable rates. And there's a lot of very negative proposals coming out of the utilities who want to basically stop investment and hinder new job growth and innovation by making them pay, for instance, in some cases, up to 10 years of their projected energy costs all up front, which is unrealistic for a business to do. But beyond that, we're looking at Ohio because this kind of dynamic is happening in several states across the country, but it's really coming to a head in Ohio in 2025. So I would keep a close eye on that because that could set the stage for what that model looks like for other states going forward, depending on how they figure out how to integrate these larger industrial users.
Okay, well, we'll be keeping an eye on our good friends at the Buckeye Institute in Ohio. Thank goodness for them. Okay, let's turn it over to another big question to wrestle with. Are things going to get cheaper for people in 2025?
They could. I think that
Look into your
there's
crystal
a
ball.
possibility. Let me put it this way. There are definitely some positive initiatives in the pipeline that states are leading on to make things cheaper. So a couple of those, I mean, we all know that taxes make things more expensive, both directly in the taxes that you pay, but also indirectly in the taxes that you pay as pass-throughs that businesses have to incorporate into their costs. And on that front, Ohio, again, our friends at the Buckeye Institute are working on some tax reforms to index to inflation their tax brackets so that year over year, when inflation happens, those brackets also move with inflation. So you're not getting those stealth tax increases that are kind of flying under the radar. In Kansas and Nebraska, so Kansas Policy Institute and the Plaid Institute, respectively, they are working on different property tax reforms. In Kansas, in particular, they are working on capping property tax reform or capping property taxes increases year over year. As we all know, the housing market's a little crazy, and these very large jumps in valuations are increasing the rate that a lot of people are paying for their property taxes, not because the rates are increasing, but because the assessments of their home values are going up so much. And that's really putting a strain on, especially our seniors who are on fixed incomes often in these communities. And so they're looking at the reforms to cap those types of expenses. And I'm happy to dive into some other, we know taxes are one side of it, but regulation is also another side of it. And there's a lot to watch there as well.
What should we be watching in terms of regulation across the states? What states are really on top of this?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Rebecca. But the states that I would watch mostly are Nebraska, where again our friends at the Plaid Institute are doing great work on this, and in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, they're also doing really great work on. They're working on the same type of policy, which is called Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, or the REINS Act. This has been proposed at the federal level, but the states are working on adopting it. So, for instance, Kansas and Wisconsin both have some version of this on their books already. A few other states do as well. But basically, when you have state agencies or the governor himself or herself wants to propose a new regulation that's going to cost some certain amount to the economy, say some new rule that they're implementing that's going to cost $5 million across the state for businesses to adopt. That's going to be especially hard for small businesses to swallow. Once they hit a certain trigger in terms of how much that regulation is going to cost the state or the state's economy, then that kicks it over to the legislature and says, no, you can't unilaterally implement this. Our elected officials actually have to have a say here. You can't just make these huge laws on your own. So this is kind of one way that the legislature can rein in the executive and rein in some of those unelected bureaucrats who are often writing these rules, sometimes without even the governor knowing about them. And this is one mechanism to kind of put the legislature back in charge of that process and hold back the implementation of some of those rules before they get enacted.
Ben mentions bureaucrats and regulations at the state level. I want to just chime in and talk about what's happening at the federal level as well, because we've got the same challenge. With the new incoming administration, there's opportunities to roll back a lot of regulations. And our team over at the Center for Practical Federalism is communicating with that incoming administration and identifying rules that hamstring states and saying you need to repeal these regulations to devolve power back to the states so the states can better govern their communities. At the same time, so that's the strategy up at the top. The strategy from the bottom up is to communicate to the 520,000 state policymakers in the country and inform them of the strings that the federal government has attached. Because what happens so often is you have regulators at the federal level talking to regulators at the state level and leaving out the state legislators. It turns out that upsets state legislatures. So our team over at the Center for Practical Federalism, their first step is to create transparency around when this is happening, when the feds are telling states what to do, and just making lawmakers aware of that, and then partnering with those lawmakers to get them to take their message to the new administration and say, hey, you got to repeal these regulations. So it's not just SPN and Center for Practical Federalism taking this case to the new administration. It's also a whole coalition of state lawmakers as well. So we hope to see DC reducing the strings attached to all the states.
Very exciting. Okay, last topic. I know this has been a lot to take in, and I've got a couple more questions before we turn it over to Q&A. Ben, talk to me a little bit about healthcare. What do we need to be aware of in that realm?
Sure. So again, our focus on healthcare is increasing access and affordability. Again, those are the guiding lights. We want better health outcomes, and we see better health outcomes when people are able to access care at an affordable rate. And so with those goals in mind, some of the things that we're focused on are things like expanding scope of practice. So for instance, pharmacists, they see a lot of different patients. They work with a lot of different patients. There are a lot of different things that they are able to diagnose very quickly. And so there's a lot of efforts. In last year, we saw this happen in Tennessee through the efforts of our good friends at the Beacon Center. This year, the Virginia Institute for Public Policy is taking up this challenge, but expanding what pharmacists are actually able to do in terms of being a medical provider and providing the services that they're trained to provide. This is also the case with nurse practitioners and other non-doctor healthcare providers, but opening up what they're allowed to do so they can treat those common conditions. They can things that they recognize already, they're able to actually legally go in and address, which takes the strain off of the doctor, physician healthcare providers, and allows patients to access more providers more easily and more affordably. So that's one thing that we should watch and what we're working on. Another is taking on these certificate of need laws. 30 plus states still operate under certificate of need programs, which basically restrict any new or expanded healthcare services, and basically says that they need permission from the state to open up a new service or a new facility or something along those lines. And that really restricts care. And so one area that we're partnering on this one is with our friends at the Alabama Policy Institute. Their focus is on maternal care. So there's a lot of a lot of places in Alabama, where especially the more rural places, where expecting mothers have to drive for hours to access prenatal care, and that's ridiculous. And there's not there's not the ability for new facilities to open up because of these restrictive laws. So repealing those laws or reforming them significantly is another way to expand the options that are able to meet people's needs.
Okay. One question that came in before the show even started, and I think it's a really good one. Those of you who are watching today and have been supporting us for many years are aware that SPN is here because we are seeking a return to self-governance, and we're here to promote and protect federalism. And we do this while we are locking in with our network to get policy wins and build up durable freedom infrastructure. And with that in mind, a great question came in light of the new administration, which, as we all know, is quite different than the administration of just a few months ago when we were talking. Are we going to find ourselves in a place where there could be too much federalism and different challenges that come from that? And I think it's a fun question to ponder. So, Todd, do you want to start us off with that answer?
I would love that to be the case, and we certainly are working to make that vision a reality as much as possible. Our solution, if you have more devolution to the states, that means more policy fights are going to be happening at the state level. Like everything, all regulations, taxes, education, healthcare, all of those debates are going to be happening. So what you're going to need is organizations, state think tanks, litigation, candidate recruitment, investigative journalism. You're going to need the durable freedom infrastructure to be having all of those debates. As much as I love our national partners and we always want to work with them, and I'm glad that they exist, it's going to be impossible for them to keep up with every single fight happening in every single state. So that's where the durable freedom infrastructure in the states comes in to be ready for all of those fights. Now, I'm going to kick it over to my guy Ben over here because he has some like specific things that we're doing right now in terms of policy to get ready for that.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And so, in looking at the control that the federal government exerts on states, Todd's mentioned this already earlier in this conversation, but a lot of that control comes in the form of grants that are given to the states that have all of these strings attached to them, all of these different requirements attached to them. And oftentimes, lawmakers aren't even aware of what those strings are. They're not even aware of how many grants they're getting and that kind of thing. When I first started working in public policy over 10 years ago, I'll just leave it at that. My first boss at the Center for Practical Federal or Center for State Fiscal Reform said it was when he was talking with state lawmakers about this issue. He said, if you want to get out of the trap, you have to let go of the cheese. And I think that's really applicable here to these federal funds. But the first step in that is recognizing how many funds are you actually getting? What are those strings? And so this is something that our partners over at the Center for Practical Federalism have been working with certain state lawmakers on. Last year, Tennessee passed a reform to this effect. This year, we're looking to support Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation to get something similar adopted in Iowa. But basically, what we want to encourage state lawmakers to do is to set up some basic oversight to determine, okay, how many federal funds are we getting? What is the value of those funds? What are they for? Where are they being distributed in terms of the state government and executive agencies? And what are the strings that are attached to those funds? And just getting all of that information all out on the table, because it might be surprising, but they don't have a great grasp on all of those things. And so getting that all together in one place so that they can actually be legislatively reviewed is the first step. And then second step after that is, okay, well, now that we know that, we need to start preparing. What are our plans for if we wanted to lose, if we were going to lose certain funding, whether it's a reduction coming from the federal level because of a debt crisis, for instance, or for some other reason, there's reductions in federal funds. What is our state plan for that? Or if a state wants to exert more autonomy and they say, we don't want to do this thing that this string attaches, what is our plan for saying no and refusing that federal fund? And so they can actually make that proactive step and know how much money they're going to lose, what the plan is to cover those costs or adapt, and they can just author their own destiny a little bit more clearly.
And we're pursuing that at the most hyper local level too, helping affiliates realize this inventory of financial strings. And because Ben mentioned Iowa, just earlier this week, I had a conversation with the Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation, and they're working on a project to inject financial transparency to drive accountability at local school districts. You have to do that inventory before you can make changes or recommendations or streamline government bureaucracy. And because the beauty and the power of this network is spreading good ideas, I heard from their team, I mean, they've had conversations in the last month with the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina, the Kansas Policy Institute in Kansas, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Cardinal in West Virginia. I mean, our state partners communicate with each other all the time, whether it's facilitated by SPN or on their own accord. And that's going to help drive that inventory so that if and when the opportunity does come for more federalism, our affiliates are making sure their states are prepared.
Thanks, Jane. Another question came in from Martin. Martin, thanks for asking this question. Are there, in addition to what you all just outlined, because I think you answered most of this question, are there additional levers that the states can use to push back against federal overreach? And I know that Tony Woodley for Madison from our Center for Practical Federalism could have a whole show dedicated to answering this question. So perhaps we'll put that on the list. But anything quickly that you want to add, Todd?
Yeah, I would love to have a whole show on that. And Tony could communicate this a lot better than me. But one of the things is the feds often impose regulation and guidance that is illegal. There's no statutory backing, or they have failed to follow some procedure. And so one of the things that state and local officials can do is to not comply. To do their homework first and make sure that they're not complying with something that is lawful, and then not comply, and then call the feds bluff, and see if the feds actually do something. And then you can follow up with litigation. But yeah, figure out what it is that the feds are doing illegal, and then do not comply, and call their bluff.
And if you know anyone interested in that, let us know, because we'll connect you to Tony and an entire strategy around it. We are short on time, so I have one more question for each of you, which is this. It's December 31st, 2025, and I've just sent you the nicest bottle of champagne I can afford. Something big has happened, and you're so excited because this policy win is a linchpin. You weren't sure it would happen, and it's going to be the kind of thing that will impact other states or other states can learn from, and you're so excited about it. You're going to open up that champagne and celebrate and have a big toast. What has happened? Jane, you go first.
I know we touched a little bit on what's going on in South Carolina, but I just really can't overstate the heroic efforts of Wendy Dameron and her team, and what they're doing to give certainty to families. We're talking about 3,000 kids from low-income families who started the school year at a new school where many of them were thriving, and that was yanked away from them. Their families can't afford to continue that. So Wendy's leadership coming to their rescue, making sure that they had the resources they need, at least to get through the remainder of this year, and then the input from other CEOs in the network to help Wendy build durable freedom infrastructure and create a C4 arm to help their advocacy efforts. I just can't think of a better success story that I am so privileged to get to witness and be a part of. And while it's a small state, the geographic pressure in the Southeast that I think that's going to drive can't be more exciting.
Okay, thank you. Ben, your turn.
This is it's difficult to narrow it down to just one, but I think I'm gonna be popping champagne over a market-friendly framework for adopting those large industrial scale electricity users onto the grid or allowing them behind the meter to do self-generation if they want to do spin up their own. There's been some different discussions about spinning up their own energy sources that they're able to use that's not associated with the grid and is not regulated by the utilities of the grid. That's going to be something that will unlock a lot of energy and a lot of innovation all around, certainly in Ohio, but then could become a model for other states. And if we can get that right, and if we can get that adopted in a market-friendly way, that's certainly worth champagne.
Can I say that in a way that is not quite as wonky for me to understand to make sure I heard you right? Which I think was, which I totally like the way you said it, but I just want to make sure I understand it because I think Jane and I are on the same wavelength here. The grid is not going to be overregulated, and it will lend itself to reliability and affordability without overregulation.
And be able to meet the demands of these
Meet the
large-scale
demand
industrial users
as they expand. Yes, got
as they
it.
expand.
Okay, and
Yes,
we'll see a trend starting in Ohio. It's all
I
about Ohio.
expect to.
Okay, got it. I will watch that. And Todd, what is it, Todd?
Rocky Balboa. Balboa. I go back. The opposition hit us in South Carolina. They hit us in Nebraska. They think we're going to be laying down in the ring. But as Rocky Balboa said, it ain't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. So I want to see school choice passed in Nebraska, South Carolina, punch them back, and Tennessee and Texas so that they know they ain't stopping us.
Okay, with that, Rocky Balboa, I want to say thank you everyone for being here with us and let you know we will have future shows. It'll be so exciting because we'll have all the CEOs who are out there with their staff actually making these things happen. So we'll give you updates throughout the year. Tracy, do you have a few words of closing? Okay, I just saw you back
No,
on.
just chime in. I've been here the whole time listening, so it's great stuff.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you soon again on the next show. And thanks again. Happy New Year and have a great day.